So the next few minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about how modern neuroscience may help change our perception of mental health disorders, including substance use disorders, which happens to be a field that is very core to my research interest. So first off, I want to give you some brand new data just came out from SAMHSA and this last month, September 2017. So it's showing you data from 2016. And what you see in this slide, basically, is the percent of people who had substance use disorders during the past year in our culture. And what you'll see, and it's divided up by different age groups, and what you'll see is that age group between 18 and 25 happens to be quite vulnerable to presenting substance use disorders. The age group between 26 and 49 is also quite high. Both of those are between 20 and 27 or 28% of our population. So we're talking about a lot of people in our culture that's suffering from mental health disorders, and I think it behooves us to learn as much as we can about this, but also to understand what these disorders are and how we can help them and promote their well-being. Now, this slide also came from the same publication, and what I want you to take home from this is that big open sort of taupe color, which shows that about 52% of those who are presenting with mental health disorders are not receiving appropriate treatment in our culture. And this statistic is not that different from what you see in other Western cultures. And I think this is really quite horrific, actually, that we have a lot of work to do to really be able to come to service with these people who are suffering from mental health disorders. We know a lot about what to do. And I'm wondering, why is it that half of the people who need treatment are not receiving it in our country? What I'd like to do is propose to you in the next few minutes that part of this may have to do with stigma and discrimination. In brief, we just don't like these people. So here's some data from a paper that just got published in 2015 that sort of illustrates this point. And I know it's a big, messy slide, but the point I want you to take home here is just to notice that the red horizontal bars are showing you a percent of people that were interviewed that were unwilling to work closely with somebody who has, for example, schizophrenia or depression in that top group. And you notice these numbers are huge, 38, 57, 34%. And then you move down to that second half, and it shows a similar kind of analysis about people who suffer from substance use disorders or drug addiction. And you'll notice that 78, 79% of the people interviewed would not want to work with someone who is suffering from substance use disorders. Now look at the blue bars. This is an interesting set of questions, I think. It's those people who are unwilling to have someone who were suffering from these mental health disorders to marry into their family. There's great fear in terms of what this might do to family dynamics. And you can see up to 92%, 94% of the people interviewed would not want someone in their family to marry someone who's suffering from substance use disorders. And yet, we know that a good number of people in our society, up to 40, 50%, are suffering from these disorders. So there's a great mismatch here. And I'd like to propose tonight that one of the things that we need to do is do a better job of understanding the brain of people who are suffering from these disorders, and maybe the stigma, this fear, would dissipate. So what I want to do is mention a few things that are new in terms of the research going on in this field. And these are just some papers that are coming out that we're really trying to study what is the state of stigma and discrimination for people who suffer from substance abuse disorders and other mental health disorders in our culture. Because once we understand this behavior, we might be able to do something about it. So here are a few publications just to let you know what's going on in the modern day literature. This is an interesting review. It's a review of publications that occurred over many, many years, and it's a very good read talking about the stigma of those who suffer from bipolar disease and schizophrenia. This one I thought was very interesting too, because there's a great stigma, of course, in the medical profession for those who might be suffering from mental health disorders. And a staggering number of those who serve in our medical professions do suffer from these disorders. And so we have to acknowledge this as well and learn how to help these people help us. So let's talk a little bit about what might be the cause, one, for mental health disorders, and number two, for our concerns about them. And I think it has to do, in part, with our struggle between nature versus nurture. What's really contributing to these mental health disorders? Is it genetic, or is it something about the environment that the individual is living in? So just to let you know that this has been discussed to great lengths throughout the literature, but what I want to guide you to is some publications that you can get online from the National Institutes of Drugs of Abuse. This is one of them, and it talks a little bit about vulnerability, genetic predispositions for substance use disorders, as well as what happens in different environments. We're going to use a few quotes from this book just to sort of underline or underscore the main concepts of this. So to start off with, I want to make sure that we can understand what the term addiction might mean. Let's get us on the same playing field here. And the National Institutes of Drugs of Abuse, or NIDA, defines addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease that's characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences. So this is important because I think we need to understand what drives these individuals so that we can then understand our fear of this and why we might have a stigma of addictions in our culture. What's important here is that NIDA is holding that addiction is a disease of the organ called the brain. Now, part of our argument tonight is going to be if we understand that the brain can be diseased, and this might result in things like addiction or depression or anxiety or schizophrenia, would we then be more apt to remove the stigma that we apply to these brain diseases? And that is certainly what is being forwarded by NIDA. Now, part of that argument is shown here, and this actually is taken from this book that I just showed you. You can download the PDF if you go to the NIDA website. So NIDA is saying that this is a brain disease because, like other disorders, this organ is not working functionally. So if you look at this scan, it's a whole body scan of a tobacco user that's on the left. And what you can see that there's many organs in the body that are not working right. The kidneys, the liver, the heart, the lungs, and the brain. Now, we understand that you can get lung cancer from tobacco now, and we call it a lung disease. NIDA is arguing that we should be comfortable with the concept of calling brain a disease state when we're addicted to tobacco as well. And if you look at the scans on the right, these are just basically comparisons between scans of a brain, and it's looking at a horizontal view, if you will, as well as a heart. And you don't have to be a good anatomist just to see that the colors are quite different in a healthy organ versus one that's a scan that's taken from an individual who is abusing, for example, cocaine. We know that cocaine can cause heart disease, and we're comfortable with that. Can we also be comfortable that cocaine can cause a brain disease? And if so, would we feel more comfortable about removing the stigma that we attach to addictions? So these are things I'd like to talk a little bit more in the next few minutes. So if drug addiction is a chronic illness with relapse rates, it's a chronic relapsing disease, I'd like to hold that these relapse rates are actually similar to those that you see with other chronic disorders, like hypertension, diabetes, and asthma. Okay, addiction is not like asthma, but the fact that it's a chronic relapsing disease is. And these disorders and this kind of chronic relapsing pathology, if you will, is true for many, many mental health disorders. I'm just using substance use here as an example. So here's an example that actually you can download this slide off the NIDA website. It was originally published in 2000, and it's a nice, simple illustration that actually puts some percentages to these comparisons in terms of relapse rates of chronic diseases. And what you can see, drug addiction is being compared to type 1 diabetes, hypertension, and asthma. And you look at the relapse rates. If you're diabetic and you go eat a donut and your blood sugar goes through the roof, we don't say, oh, this is a moral problem. You fell off the wagon. It's a failure. No, you say, quit eating donuts and take your insulin, right? Stay on your treatment. So I'd like to argue that perhaps we should think in terms of this type of empathy, understanding for diabetes, and translate that to the brain disease we call addiction. Another concept is that addiction is similar to other chronic diseases because recovery often takes a long time and requires repeated treatments. And I think this is a concept that we intuitively might understand, but maybe emotionally it really hasn't latched on to us. So this slide sort of illustrates that point. And again, this can be downloaded off the NIDA website. So let's use the example of hypertension, high blood pressure. If somebody happens to have high blood pressure and you put them on medicines that will drop their blood pressure, and as long as they stay on their meds, their blood pressure is down. This is a good therapy. Right? It's successful. And we don't then just say, oh, then take away the meds. No, it's a successful therapy because they are being treated. And we know that if they quit taking their medicines, their blood pressure is going to go up. And we say, well, of course, you have to stay on your medicine for hypertension for your blood pressure to stay down. However, if you look in the scenario of drug abuse, we sort of interpret this a little differently, don't we? So let's say someone is a heroin addict, for example. They're addicted to heroin. And they're on a methadone maintenance program. And while they're on the methadone maintenance program, they're staying abstinent from heroin. They're going to work, they're paying their taxes, and they're living with their family. All good things that might happen during a methadone maintenance program for an individual. What if they slip and they fall off the wagon, as we often say, and they take heroin one Friday night? Well, we say, oh my goodness, the treatment is a failure. No, it's not. It just means you have to stay on your treatment and stay diligent, and treatment does work. So I'd like to challenge us to think of these different pathologies under a similar umbrella, if we might. But again, don't forget, we really do realize that there is both genetic and environmental contributions to all mental health disorders, including substance use disorders. And I want to show you here just an example of all the factors that actually play into these very, very complex diseases of the brain. And these are just a few that are listed. Clearly, the family is important. Your genetic makeup clearly determines vulnerability or risk factors for developing mental health disorders, including substance use disorders. But there are a lot of things about your context, your environment, that certainly plays into the stressors, the temptations, the repeated exposures that you might have to, for example, drugs that are abused. And if you lived in a different context or a different environment, these factors may not hold such a strong hold on the propensity to develop substance use disorders, or, for example, to increase the propensity to become clinically depressed. So we should take all these things into consideration when we're thinking about mental health diseases. Now, this slide is a complicated slide that I just put in here just again to show you that there is a lot of science going on in this field, and we do know something about genetic predispositions and vulnerabilities. The challenge to modern day science, however, is to try to identify a simple readout, if you will. And one of these that we're seriously thinking about that may be of value is called Endo Phenotypes. And basically what that is, it's just showing you a particular behavioral function, if you will, that provides a mirror to the brain that seems to correlate nicely with brain function and your genetic makeup. And this was a lovely study that sort of made this point come home. It was published in 2014. Basically, what you're seeing here are three sort of 3D reconstructions of brains. And what they're illustrating are three different types of personality. The blue personality is enthusiastic, highly motivated. The red personality is a negative personality kind of individual. And the green is showing you one that may be impulsive or a risk taker, all right? What's shown in here in these sort of cutouts are the different anatomical pathways that we now know are involved in these different behaviors. What's shown in the boxes below that match these colors happen to describe some of the genes that we know that are linked to these behaviors within these pathways. So what I just want you to see is, for example, the gene, the D2 receptor gene, which is a receptor for the transmitter dopamine, which is in blue, and the dopamine transporter protein, both of these happen to be important in transmitting this reward transmitter dopamine. If you have a particular gene that makes an efficient one of these proteins, these happen to be protective factors against subsequently developing substance use disorders. okay? Doesn't mean you're guaranteed not to suffer from substance use disorders. It just means that you have a decreased risk. In contrast, if you look at the middle panels, these are red, and this is illustrating a protein called a serotonin transporter protein. And there are different variants of this particular gene that if you have those variants or alleles, you actually have an increased risk for developing substance use disorders. But you put these people with an increased risk in a good environment, their chances are very good that they're not going to suffer from this disorder. So there is indeed an important balance between genes and environment, and we're starting to learn what these things are. And if we can indeed use things like Endo Phenotypes to determine, let a personality to tell us something about the brain, we will do a better job of customizing the treatment for these individuals, as well as being aware of the contribution of their context or their environment in their propensity to develop the disorder in the first place. So having said that then, why do people take drugs to start with then? Because you can't say it's just an environment, you can't say it's just their genes. People make a conscious choice to take a drug, in contrast to having a conscious choice of developing schizophrenia, for example, or of developing depression. So this is where the stigma may be particularly acute, is for substance use disorders, because we believe that people make choices here. So this is a concept that's being put forward by NIDA as well. And it looks like people will take drugs for the first time for two reasons. One is to feel good, and the other one is to feel better. And these two concepts actually are very, very important in terms of mental health as well. Because what we know is to feel better, that means you're probably self-medicating for an underlying pathology, like depression. So maybe you are truly clinically depressed, and you're self-medicating with cocaine so that you feel better. So this is not unthinkable. It's not horrific if you think of it in those terms. And indeed, if these people were getting the appropriate treatment for the depression, perhaps the need to explore cocaine or to continue taking cocaine would be less. The other type of person is to feel good. These are the risk takers, the impulsive people. And so if we would know something about these personalities, we might be able to help change the context or their environment such that their proclivity to take risks wouldn't mean that they're going to start exploring with drugs like cocaine or heroin or methamphetamine. So, if initial decision to take drugs is voluntary, then the question might arise, is the desire to stop taking drugs not also voluntary? Well, what NIDA would propose is say, maybe not. Because what happens with repeated exposure to drugs, your brain changes. It changes in very fundamental ways, such that one's ability to make a healthy choice is actually compromised. And so we're going to talk about this just briefly in the next couple of slides. But what I want you to think about, though, is the spiral that happens, particularly for substance use disorders, where one might be taking drugs for the first time to feel good or feel better. Maybe you're self-medicating, or you just want the euphoric effect that you get with these drugs. But what happens is with repeated exposure and repeated reasons for taking your drugs, your brain changes, and your reason to take the drug then changes. Indeed, the drug doesn't feel good anymore. You may not even like it anymore, but you must have it. You want it. You must have it to feel normal. So to understand this spiral that is the addiction process, and whether you start that spiral by already being depressed, or, for example, if you exhibit schizophrenia, by the way, 97% of patients who suffer from schizophrenia abuse one drug or another. It's typically nicotine. There's something interesting about this, isn't there? Then we'll understand more what's happening during these different phases, and we'll do a better job of interceding and changing this spiral pathway, I believe. So just the last point I want to make then has to do with this concept that in that spiral has to do with the fact that the parts of the brain that are involved in making healthy choices are indeed those particular parts that are compromised by many mental health disorders. And I'm going to talk again in terms of substance use disorders as an example here. But what I'm showing you here is just a cartoon, if you will, of a human brain facing this way, right? So the front of the brain is here on your left. and the back of the brain is on your right. What we're showing here are different subfields, if you will, of the brain that are going to be very important in our explanation of making healthy choices. And what we know is that the part of the brain that's very important in executive function is this frontal lobe. Okay? We as humans are very, very proud of our frontal lobe. It's big. It's lumpy. We have lots of neurons. So we should be very good at making good, healthy choices, you would think, right? Well, this part of the brain actually is divided into two major compartments, if you will. And one is colored in green. And this is, for example, your orbital frontal cortex. This part of the brain, or the frontal cortex, is very much involved in what we call motivational drive. It's what makes you get up and eat breakfast and go to work and be happy. It motivates you to do things. That's your orbital frontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, or the anterior cingulate gyrus, is involved in a particular part of our behavior called inhibitory control. Now, some of us have good inhibitory control, some of us may not. So, for example, let's say there's a brownie sitting here on the table. If I have good inhibitory control, I might be able to say, oh, okay, I should not eat that brownie because it's got 1,000 calories, and I'm going to have dinner in 30 minutes, and it's going to make me gain weight, and it's going to make me feel bad. If I happen to have difficulty with my inhibitory control, it may be very hard for me to say, no, don't eat that brownie. Well, you can imagine how important this might be in making healthy choices. Well, these two brain regions, though, receive input from other brain regions that are actually similar to brain regions that are in all animals that we happen to study in the laboratory. One of those brain regions happens to be the nucleus accumbens, and its cousin, the ventral pallidum, and you'll see those in red. These are brain regions that actually happen to have a lot of transmitter dopamine. And this transmitter is the reward transmitter, and these brain regions are involved in feeling good. And what's regulating these regions as well is the hippocampus and the amygdala. And both of these regions are involved in learning and memory. And the amygdala happens to be perfectly situated to be involved in what we call emotional memory. So that brownie, oh, I remember that brownie. I remember it tasted so good. I really, really, really like that brownie. So that emotional memory of the reward that I got with dopamine being released in the nucleus accumbens informs my cortical regions, and they have to battle it out to decide if I'm going to eat that brownie or not. But that's how we make choices. Now, what happens in a situation where an individual has been abusing drugs, almost independent of the type of drug they're abusing? Well, what happens is the executive function of the frontal cortex is actually compromised. That is the brain region, in part, that these drugs will work on. And it's down-regulated. It's hypo-functioning, and it has less activity. And we know this from human studies as well as preclinical studies in laboratory animals. And what happens if your frontal cortex is not working so well? Well, that means your inhibitory control goes offline. And what's left? That orbital frontal cortex. And it says, go, 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 go. I love that brownie. It made me feel so good. I'm going to eat it. I don't care what happens. So this is exactly the type of decision-making processes that occur in someone who has a disease of the frontal cortex. All right? Substance use disorders happens to be one of them. It's not the only one. Affective disorders, schizophrenia, depression, all have pathology in the frontal cortex. So the capacity to make healthy choices are very, very much compromised. Now, what we can do in the lab is we're working on drugs that are going to change the way we process this information. For example, in our lab, we want to break the link between emotional memories and the decision-making process, and we believe that we're going to be coming up with compounds that are going to stop the craving for that brownie and help us make healthy choices. That's what modern science is doing. But I want you to say in conclusion that we have a long way to go. We still, in terms of mental health disorders and in substance use disorders in particular, we still sort of apply a moral overtone. These people should know better. They should be able to control your tics, control your outbursts. We need to realize this is something to do with the disease state of the brain, and we need to understand it better. So my last slide is this one, and I know it's a busy slide, but what I wanted to do is to give you a taste of the modern research that's going on that's dealing with this concept of stigma, and to provide answers how we can improve our understanding of and our judgment of people who have mental health disorders, as well as the substance use disorders. And in this list, you'll see there's very good ideas that are being empirically studied and validated that this is helping change attitudes about stigma and discrimination, portraying those disorders as a brain disease, and they're treatable. Treatment does work, does change attitudes, improving both community and self-mental health literacy to understand what it's like and what it means to have a mental health disorder, both the individual who suffers from the disorder as well as our community and our families. Mental health stigma reduction training and healthcare education, and I'm talking medical school curriculum and in continuing medical education and in training our nurses and training our PAs. We're finding that these types of lectures do make a difference. Classroom-based education in high school on mental illness stigma. This was a great paper. It really is important because, as you know, teenagers are struggling with their feelings, and depression and suicide rates are very high in adolescence. And having this built into their education does change outcomes. Stigma reduction initiatives targeted to individuals living with mental health disorders and their families, as well as their workplace. Very good outcomes when this type of curriculum is instigated as part of their treatment. Policy changes. This is really, really important for us as a culture, and this is one example that I think is a good one. In 2004, California established a strategic plan on reducing stigma and discrimination, and in 2013, there was a follow-up on its effectiveness, and it's impressive. Policy does make a difference. And last, this is a publication that I thought sort of raised a question in my head, and I wanted to leave it with you tonight. And that is, I think we need more stigma reduction interventions that are culturally relevant. We have different cultures. We're not all the same. And for these to resonate within different religious contexts, different ideologies, and different racial contexts, we're going to have to be more tuned into this, because mental health disorders are a very personal thing. And until we get these culturally relevant types of education programs in place, I think we still have a long way to go. But the good news is we are getting there. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions later on during the program.
Thank you, Dr. Napier. Our next speaker for the evening is Dr. Orson Morrison. Dr. Morrison is the director of the DePaul Family and Community Services and is an affiliate clinical associate professor at DePaul University. Dr. Morrison's professional interests and areas of expertise include clinical management, psychotherapy with underserved children, adolescents, and families, psychological assessment, multiculturalism, and working within a social justice and empowerment framework. Dr. Morrison?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much. I am happy to be here to share some of my thoughts and to review some of the research pertaining to adolescent mental health, particularly as it relates to teens' use of social media and technology. I bring my background as a practicing psychologist for over 12 years, my role as director of DePaul Family and Community Services, which is a full-service pediatric behavioral health clinic on DePaul's Lincoln Park campus. Also private practice in Oak Park, and most importantly, father of 2 sons who are very quickly outpacing my knowledge of technology. So I'm constantly learning from them. It is not surprising, I'm sure, to all of you that the topic of adolescent health and social media use is been recently very, very prominent in our media. We've seen recent articles by Lindsay Holmes in the Huffington Post, August 2017 edition, talking about the increased suicide rates for adolescents. We've seen Susan Schrobdorf's article in Time magazine in October 2016, really characterizing the teen years as a very, very distressful time where teens are managing social media, climate change, racism, sexism, all of these current issues, really, really putting enormous pressures on this generation of adolescents. We've also very recently seen Jean Twenge, her article in The Atlantic this month, really calling out smartphone use with the iGen generation. These are teens born between 1995 and 2012 who she characterizes as just being more comfortable in their bedrooms, on their smartphones, instead of really exploring what's typically associated with adolescence, that drive for independence and kind of exploring one's identity and being out there in the real world. So that's what's really pervasive in our media right now. So the statistics are alarming. Adolescent suicide rates have shown an increase. So from 2007 to 2015, we've seen a 31% increase in suicide rates for adolescent boys, and and doubling of the rates for adolescent girls. And while these rates are still lower than the peak rates in the early 1990s, they're still really concerning, and it's concerning that the trend is rising. In terms of overall depression rates, we also see similar trends. So in the 12-month prevalence rates for one episode of major depression, we've also seen increases there. So in 2005, the overall rate was 8.7%, and in 2014, it went up to 11.3%. I think in trying to make sense and understand these trends, it's really important to review kind of the hallmarks and developmental tasks associated with adolescence so that we can sort of take a developmental perspective when understanding these results. So very briefly, obviously adolescents are entering a phase of life where physical growth is more prominent. Adolescents are going through a time when their hormones are changing, their bodies are changing, their brains are changing in relation to all of this, and really priming them for setting themselves up for more romantic, more intimate relationships, more deep social connection that will then set them up for those relationships in early adulthood. Cognitively, we see teens being primed for more hypothetical, logical thinking, abstract thinking, sort of that higher order cognitive skills. We also see a great deal of idealism during adolescence. So we see teens who are challenging the status quo, who are thinking of how to change the world, how to make the world a better place, becoming socially active. Socially, a major task in adolescence is identity exploration and development. So teens are trying to figure out who they are in relation to their family of origin, outside of their family of origin. And emotionally, teens are really trying to experience and understand the limits of their emotional lives and emotional states. Adolescence is also a time of great risk-taking. We know that in the brain, the pathways associated with the neurotransmitter dopamine are becoming very, very active during this phase in development, and so teens are more likely to take risks and to become motivated towards things that are feeling good. And this is also this raises potential for addictions, as those pathways are very highly involved in addiction as well. So during adolescence, the brain undergoes what's called neuronal pruning. And so as a child, at birth, we have very few neurons, and over time, particularly in the early childhood, the brain is just proliferating neurons and getting more and more capacity. And during adolescence, the brain goes through a period of really trying to synthesize, to streamline, to make those connections more efficient and more integrated. And so adolescence is a really critical period during development. So I review these hallmarks of adolescence just so that we all understand just how important the developmental phase of adolescence is. So let's dive a little bit more into the technology use patterns during adolescence. Now, the Pew Research Center has done a really excellent job of putting together a series of research articles looking at the topic of adolescent technology and social media use. In some of their research, they found that 75% of teens have access now to a smartphone device, and 30% have access to a basic phone. 92% of teens report going online daily, and if we look a little bit deeper into that group of kids, 56% say they go online several times a day, 24% go online almost constantly, and 12% say they go online once a day. 6% say they go online weekly, and even very few go online less often than weekly. So clearly, smartphone use and going online is quite a prominent activity during adolescence. Similarly, 55% of teens spend time every day texting with friends. So it's become a really important tool in adolescents' communication with their peers, with their family members. And overall, teens are spending an average of 8 hours or more a day using some form of digital media device. This is data from another source, which is really describing access again to smartphones and other devices. So from this study, over half of adolescents now own a personal smartphone. And in terms of tablet ownership, we see that teens actually have a higher rate of tablet ownership than the general adult population. So teens are having more and more access to these devices, even exceeding the adult population. So let's look a little bit more at the benefits associated with social media and technology. Clearly, there are some benefits to technology and social media, and they can really tap into some really important, developmentally important aspects. So online communication can greatly expand and diversify with technology. Teens, particularly older teens, are reaching far and wide in terms of their connections to other populations, to kids, to adults that are different ages than themselves, to different genders, different geographic locations. So it can really be a powerful tool to use in diversification of one's social network. It really can dramatically increase the breadth of stimulation of all kinds, different information at our fingertips. It can also provide a really nice platform for teens to begin to express that sense of idealism. And, we often see teens using the platforms for advocacy work and social justice work. There are several models which speak to the benefits associated with technology use. One is the rich get richer hypothesis, and this is when technology use can actually augment prior strong social relationships. So if kids or teens have existing relationships that are already strong, adding on the technology piece can actually make those relationships even stronger, because there's sort of an added tool in communication. There's a social compensation model, and this is when a teen may have a predisposition. They may be shy, they may be socially anxious, and technology gives them a tool to use to break through some of their anxiety in a more comfortable way, and connect with other teens. There's also a social support model where teens, for instance, who may be isolated or may not have a very well-developed social support network can actually reach out to other teens that share a similar experience. For example, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, intersex population, children with illnesses, and children with disabilities. So they can use these tools to connect, to reduce the sense of isolation that they may feel in their own smaller communities. So some of the concerns or the challenges associated with technology use, the social media is constant. It's a constant stream of information that's coming at us all the time. And I think this can create a sense of fear and anxiety, particularly for marginalized groups. We've seen a lot of focus in the media recently around police brutality, for instance, and immigration debates that are happening online. And this is stressful for most of us, but I think for kids that are that come from these marginalized groups, it can really create some very, very intense fears and anxieties. While social media can be used to explore and build one's identity, there's also a concern that it can be used to create false sense of identity. Teens are more and more pressured to sort of curate their social media profiles and to manage their reputations online and to demonstrate to others that they're popular, right? They have hundreds of friends that they've connected to, or that many peers have liked their posts. So there's this pressure to sort of keep up with that image, which may not be their true authentic selves. And so that's the concern with this particular issue. Technology. There's also concern that technology use and social media use displaces other developmentally important tasks associated with adolescence. So family time, time with friends, forming those deep social connections. Again, developmentally, teens are at a phase in life where they're learning how to be more deeply, more intimately connected to other people, and sort of setting them up for later adulthood. And so if they're online all the time, if they're on their smartphones all the time, if that's the primary mode that they're communicating with people, are they really spending enough time developing that ability to form deeper connections? In one study, I talked about how 25% of teens, only 25% of teens spend time in person with their friends on a daily basis outside of school. So it's a very, very low number. Some of the other concerns or challenges, there's a lot going on in the adolescent brain, right? And so this work really requires a lot of downtime, adequate downtime, time to rest, time to reflect, time to introspect. And, you wonder, are modern teens ever sort of alone to do that work? And are they, is the rest that's required for that really being impacted by frequent online and technology use? One study looked at sleep And the changes in sleep between this particular study, 1991 and 2012. So teens in 1991 reported, about 72% of them reported receiving 7 hours of sleep or more, versus in 2012, about 63% of teens in that same age group reported getting enough sleep. So there is some trend in terms of decreased sleep. Parent-child relationships can also be impacted. Advances in technology have really challenged parents' ability to monitor and to stay engaged with parts of their teens' online lives. It can also flip the hierarchy typically associated with the parent-child relationship as teens become more technologically savvy than their own parents. So it becomes really hard to maintain power and control. Cyberbullying is another issue. About 23% of teens report being cyberbullied, according to this particular article. Pornography use, 23 to 95% of 10 to 19-year-olds report having viewed pornography. So there are very significant concerns. This is where the research is currently going. We're becoming more nuanced in terms of how we're studying this. And so this particular article is looking at different types of digital media. And because of time, I'm going to kind of just briefly skim through this. But this is where the research needs to go in terms of looking at different types of media and the limits and what's appropriate use. At what point does it become too much? And so these are some interesting research outcomes here. So strategies for adults, obviously help them, discuss with them, capitalize on that higher order thinking that's happening with adolescents, help them to problem solve these tasks. Look at social media conflicts that are happening in their own lives or in hypothetically, and just use that as a discussion point. Help teens balance alone time, make sure they're getting enough alone time to introspect. Designate screen-free time, screen-free zones in the home. Bedrooms have been a prime place where teens are now using multiple media devices. So really consider changing that. Adults are really important models for how to do this. So even with cyberbullying, like how as adults are we engaging in using technology on our Facebook posts? Are we engaging respectfully in debates and conversations online with other people? Okay. I'm just going to skip through some of these here. I think that the most important takeaway here is moderate use. Moderate use that doesn't displace other developmentally appropriate tasks. So remember that teens need a certain amount of sleep, 8 to 10 hours a night. So taking your smartphone into your bedroom and having that going all night is not the best strategy. 60 minutes of moderate, vigorous activity, less than 2 hours of sedentary screen time per day for adolescents. So really making sure that those key needs are getting met before allowing and adding on technology and social media use. The American Academy of Pediatrics does have a template on how to have this conversation with teens, and so that's an important place to continue to have those discussions. So I hope this has been helpful in terms of thinking about the current research and about strategies for really helping teens live a healthy, developmentally rich life.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. Our next presenter is Dr. Lisa Rosano. Dr. Rosano is a tenured associate professor of psychiatry and deputy director of the Center on Mental Health Services Research and Policy at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's also the director for the James Scholar Program at the UIC College for Medicine. She's the co-principal investigator for the Center on Integrated Healthcare and Self-Directed Recovery. Dr. Rosano is recognized internationally for her research and workforce development programs focusing on mental health, physical health comorbidities, mental health aspects of HIV/AIDS, and community services research. Dr. Rosanna?
Thank you. So I am very happy to be here, and one of the things that we do at the Center on Mental Health Services Research and Policy is we look across a great, we like to think, wide savanna about the many things that help individuals in recovery promote independent community living. And one of the things that we've been addressing for probably at least 5 to 10 years has been the health comorbidities of physical illness that we see among individuals who would have major psychiatric disabilities or serious mental illnesses, what we used to refer to in DSM-4 as an Axis 1 mental health disorder, but now without the multi-axial system, of course, of DSM-5, that has changed. So one of the things that you can consider here as kind of an anchor for what we see in social health disparities and things that drive health disparities are the characteristics that have been outlined by Healthy People 2020. And this is really a blueprint for the kinds of factors that affect population health for everyone in the population, general population. Then you can start to carve out different subgroups of individuals based on these characteristics. And one of the things that's most important about this is that these are things linked to long-term health disparities among people at a huge population level. So it's not just individuals, these are people who would generally be characterized by these things. The thing's really important about this is that most of these characteristics do not exist in isolation. And when you think about the intersection in your own life of how many of these categories you might check off if you were looking at a box that might apply to you, these are certainly not in isolation, they're not siloed, they're in fact very, very additive effects. The two that I've highlighted here are mental health and cognitive disorders. They are vastly different things, at the mental health and diagnostic level, but when you think about most mental illnesses, particularly things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorders, oftentimes people have what we would just loosely call psychotic features. Those psychotic features often include cognitive disorganization, structural issues with cognitive, many of the things that Dr. Napier talked about in terms of your frontal lobe activity, your dopamine pathways, and diffuse activity throughout the brain. But you also see some things here that are related to just who you are. The important one that I think we probably want to talk about, and I will come back to, I think it's a laser pointer, but don't quote me, would be socioeconomic status. Because if you asked me in terms of mental health and mental illness and the invasion of both mental illnesses and physical comorbidities, the great equalizer up here is poverty across the board. And poverty is enormously influential, not only in physical health disparities and access to treatment, but in what we will see as the progression of those illnesses. So this is what I can tell you. A number of years ago, the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, officially known as NASHBID, did a study of 36 states, which included Illinois, in a report by Parks in 2006. They published the report that launched a lot of health research, and what we've actually found is that the morbidity or the invasion of symptoms and the progression of illness, and really just how sick you are from your illness, and the mortality or the likelihood that your illness is going to kill you, really showed some pronounced differences among individuals with major mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. What they were able to ascertain is that for an average individual with a serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, compared to an individual in the general population, there are 25 years life lost compared to those individuals. So if the average lifespan of an American woman is about 77 years old, I believe, if you're an individual who has been in recovery from a serious mental disorder, you're starting to see the invasion of a chronic illness, its symptoms, and its ability to progress and kill you, starting at the time you're about 50 to 55 years old. And so this is an alarming issue, as you might imagine. Now, when you control for things, because people roll up and they say, oh, Dr. Rosanna, do these people commit violent acts? Are they suicidal? When you control for these things, nearly 60% of the illnesses and the disparities that we see in illness are things that are preventable and treatable. So they are not the results of suicide or some other kind of particularly violent act. Although I will take a moment and say, individuals with serious mental illness are exponentially more likely to be victims of a crime and to experience violence, to experience trauma, emotional trauma, and physical trauma than they are to actually perpetrate violence in virtually every single study Every single type of study, whether it's survey, epidemiological, case report records, multiple countries. And so the pervasive stigma that my colleagues have talked about in policy and in practice probably reaches out nowhere further than when you look at forensics and criminal justice and mental illness. And so that is an area where we see pervasive stigma. In health, one of the things that we see is what we see here. So if you think about the illnesses that are on this list, many of them are illnesses of aging. I'll admit I'm 54 years old. Do I want to start thinking about my cardiac health? No. Am I obliged to think about my cardiac health? Yes. So it's just something, as we get older, the probability of us having cardiac illness or heart attack or any of these kinds of things increases. But when you take age out of the equation and you look at lifestyle factors, why would we see disparate rates of diabetes among people with serious mental disorders? Well, the actual treatments that we ask people with serious mental illnesses to engage in, particularly frontline pharmacological treatments, are more likely to cause metabolic disorders, metabolic syndrome, body fat, diabetes than virtually any other treatment that we see. And so the side effects of psychiatric treatment are one of the drivers of many of these illnesses, particularly what you'll see here in diabetes. Not exclusively, and I'll come back to that, but they're a huge influence in that. So one of the bonuses that you have, if you take an antipsychotic medication in a particular class, and you're adherent to that medication the way your psychiatrist and the nurse, and your case manager and your social worker all want you to be, the outcome could be that you live with adult onset diabetes, and that's just your life now. Cardiovascular diseases include hypertension and high cholesterol, again, diseases of aging, but when you see body mass index over 30 or 40, you see increases in blood pressure. You also see increases in cholesterol, and I'll come back to those. Renal and kidney diseases. One of the things that we see in renal and kidney diseases are the consequences of untreated hypertension, which is something that you see in all population studies of individuals who are more likely to have high blood pressure. But also ask yourselves what we are asking people with serious mental illnesses to do. How many of you have heard the term first episode psychosis? What are we asking people, what age are people with first episode psychosis approximately? Anywhere between 15 to 23. So an individual experiences psychosis for the first time, they enter into a psychiatric treatment facility or they enter into some form of psychiatric service. We start to ask them to take what? Medication as a frontline opportunity to reduce their symptoms. You're asking a person now to take a pharmacological agent for the rest of their lives. A pharmacological agent that can hurt their liver function can also hurt their renal function. And so if you have untreated hypertension, using a pharmacological agent for 50 years, at some point your kidneys might protest that. Non-viral liver diseases would include the consequences of alcoholism, for example. Cirrhosis of the liver is a common consequence that you see. Vitamin deficiencies or something, nutritional deficiencies that can cause liver diseases. And non-viral liver diseases also can be related to long-term use of what can be toxic-like pharmacological agents. And so we do see liver disorder on multiple levels for people in recovery. We get to infectious diseases, which is an area of interest for me. How many of you have been reading about the diffuse inflammation that characterizes individuals with depression or schizophrenia, the two diagnoses you're most likely to read in inflammation? You should read about this. It's really interesting because all of us talk about the brain. And you know, the brain is, I love her. She's high maintenance. She's in charge of everything. But your brain and your nervous system is not the end. What else do you have throughout your body that's consistently sending feedback to your brain all the time? Well, you have your peripheral nervous system. It's not like you get past your neck and, you know, the brain is it. The brain has a highway of thousands of neurons that are sending feedback from your body. So when we see people with chronic illnesses, in chronic pain, that have neuropathy and other feelings throughout their body, it sends signals back to their brain about their wellness. In infectious diseases like HIV, when you have pervasive inflammation throughout the immune system, you actually send signals back to the brain that can cause substrate level changes, which can result in something like depression. So when you look at worldwide, what is the most common comorbidity with physical health illnesses based on reports from the World Health Organization? Depression. Close to 48% of individuals living with HIV worldwide have clinically relevant symptoms of depressive illness. who could have had it beforehand, who could have it at the substrate level change, who could have it for all kinds of reasons. HIV appears among individuals with a psychiatric illness or a serious mental illness 70 times the rate of the general population. Viral hepatitis appears 11 times the rate of the general population, and tuberculosis is also elevated. Luckily for us here in the United States, we have much more rigorous treatment paradigms for tuberculosis than what you would see worldwide, because we are able to generally initiate medication therapies for tuberculosis here. I will tell you the United States now has on record 12 treatment-resistant strains of tuberculosis because of things like medication adherence, inability to follow through, undiagnosed or untreated things in institutional settings. And so again, tuberculosis can be a factor, less here, but other places. And then we get to respiratory conditions, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorders, asthma. If you're a person with schizophrenia, you are more likely to have asthma than virtually every other diagnosis, which could be related to inflammation. There's theories about in utero substrate changes related to people who later are diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then smoking-related conditions. And I cannot emphasize enough the impact or the negative impact of smoking in general, but certainly among people with serious mental illnesses. People with schizophrenia, a recent report in JAMA Psychiatry, smoke 3.5 times the rate of the general population, 300 times the rate of the general population. They are 3.5 times more likely to die of a COPD or respiratory-related illness compared to individuals in the general population. I know a psychiatrist at Dartmouth College who actually studies nicotine addiction and use in people with schizophrenia, and she has actually used biofeedback mechanisms to determine that they can puff longer on a cigarette than people in the general population, and they actually draw smoke deeper into their lungs than people in the general population. And so smoking-related illness is a serious issue across the board. And, understanding how nicotine interacts with your dopamine pathway and all these complicated kinds of pharmacological things are not necessarily that well understood. But we do know that nicotine and dopamine have a relationship, and so if you're taking a medication that is a dopamine inhibitor or a dopamine excitatory chemical and you smoke on top of that, nicotine can actually change how that chemical can affect your brain. And I will defer back to my colleague, Dr. Napier, if we're going to talk any more about that mechanism. So what we do is we try to come up with health promotion, because if you're telling me that 60% of these illnesses are preventable, well, then I should be preventing them. I can't necessarily prevent mental illness yet, but I certainly can prevent people with mental illness from dying 25 years sooner than individuals in the general population with ostensibly good primary prevention, health literacy, and health promotion. And the way that we do this is we approach it from a very cognitive behavioral paradigm, which includes, of course, behavioral components, changing, reasoned action, all of these kinds of theories around behavior, but also looking at some of those cognitive components. And here you'd see things like motivational interviewing, which is pervasively used. Substance use has done years of research on using motivational interviewing, and you can extend and generalize that technique into many different venues in mental health care. And then the question now becomes mobile health technology. And in this population, I will say that the issues are probably a little more complicated with mobile health technology for some of those reasons we talked about on Healthy People 2020. So some of the models that we've developed and tested at our center that you might be interested in is we have done some health fairs and screenings, and I talk about those because they are the easiest community intervention that you can probably do with anyone in the general population for virtually no money. We have the medication adherence programs 1 and 2, which is a community health navigator-based medication program where we actually sent assertive navigators out into the community to meet with people with HIV to deliver a medication adherence curriculum tailored to their own medication plans. We have people with anywhere from 1 or 2 pharmacological agents in HIV treatment. I think the most we had in our research was a woman who was taking 32 different pharmacological compounds at the same time. Every day, she had to manage 32 different medications. When we asked her what they were, she could probably tell us what about a third of them actually were for. And that was like, this is for HIV. This is for blah. What's that one for? Not sure. What's this one for? I think that one's because I take the blue one, which makes me feel a way that this makes me feel better about. Ask yourself, if you could manage 32 medications a day. Nutrition, exercise, and wellness for recovery is now an evidence-based curriculum that we're testing that actually looks at metabolic syndromes. It uses motivational interviewing, it uses goal setting, and people actually do try to combine meal planning, understanding what their metabolic issues are, and we're actually looking at the impact of medically based indicators, including glucose A1C, a major indicator for diabetes management. We're looking at hypercholesteremia. We're looking at hypertension in that population to see if it reduces. We have wellness recovery action planning for wellness and whole health action management, where they're actually both peer-led interventions where individuals in recovery themselves go out and they try to help their peers be successful in treating both mental illnesses as well as physical comorbidities. And then, we do have a foundation in many of these theories, but I will tell you, many individuals with mental illnesses are in a perhaps even pre-contemplative stage. And so for them to actually make any kind of health benefit would be a relatively big thing. No, I've killed it. Are we offline? That's okay, I always am prepared for an interpretive dance. Which no one, thank goodness, has had to see yet. Okay, so the values of health screenings are actually very positive. I can come over here and hopefully not create too much feedback. The last one providing important epidemiological data is really for me and my research friends, but they can possibly affect people, and I'll show you just a little bit of how we've been able to do that. We conducted a national health screening here in the United States with 450 approximately individuals with severe mental illness, where we have them come in and do a pre-test interview. They stayed for about 90 minutes and they went to 10 different stations, as all of you might have done at some point in a health fair. And we did medical grade testing on a few of these things. Cholesterol and A1C were both used with finger stick devices, which are the same thing you would get in the urgent care or the Minute Clinic at the CVS. I have no endorsement there. What you can see on the left is the rate of illnesses for our population with serious mental illnesses, and on the right you can see the presence of those illnesses in the population. One thing I will tell you is we detected high cholesterol at a much lower rate, but then we asked how many people were on statins, and the majority of them were already being treated for high cholesterol. So we weren't testing a disparity, we were testing health management in that particular case. Same thing with hypertension. Look at nicotine dependence. We found in this study that 44% of people are smokers compared to 13% in the general population. Among those who smoke, 62% of those individuals were highly addicted to nicotine, meaning the first cigarette that they take every day is within the first 30 minutes of them rolling over and putting their feet on the floor. Alcohol and obviously substance dependence, as our colleague talked about, is one of the key issues that we face. As many as 55 to 60% of individuals with serious mental illnesses have a co-occurring substance use disorder in addition to diabetes or hypertension or something on top of that. And then we found that when we used a multivariable predictor like the Framingham Heart Study Indicators, which looks at your hypertension, your cholesterol, your gender, stratified by age, and includes whether you're diabetic and a smoker, we found based on age estimates about 3% of the population is at risk for heart attack in the next 10 years. Close to 10% of the people that we surveyed were at risk for a coronary event in the next 10 years. Most of them had never considered the additive effect. But what we also did find is in the 60 to 90 minutes that they were at the health fair, we actually were able to provide literacy information, illness-based information, and improve their own self-reports of their abilities to take care of their health and engage in their health practices. And also what we received is their pretty much their competence about health maintenance. The thing I love about my doctor, she's always like, lose weight, do this, exercise more. And I look at her and say, how should I do that? And then she just looks back at me and says, here's a pamphlet, or here's a blah, here's an app. No, it's not going to happen. You need to lose 50 pounds. Okay, that's going to take me a year and a half to do it healthily. You got to break these things up. A good friend of mine said, you ask people in healthcare with whatever kind of illness it is to move a boulder. And what you really have to help them do is put some dynamite under it and blow it up into little pieces, because it's much easier to remove gravel than it is to move a boulder. And that's one of the things we have to do is we say, you should improve your health. How about you try to lose 5 pounds so that you actually can do it? Because the long range goal of something like 50 pounds, I'm telling you, you're looking way down the tunnel on something like that. The other thing that I think is important is to think about these ways that these things are sustainable. So one of the things that we encounter is that health apps and watches and Fitbits and Jawbones and all this electronica that we're all draping all over ourselves is really a sign of privilege for the most part. People in public mental health systems don't have smartphones. They have a government-issued flip phone that they can text on, and that's about as far as it goes. So recently, Scientific American just published a paper about a use of an application for hearing voices if you have schizophrenia. Well, that's great. You have to have a smartphone. So even if you could get a smartphone, what do you need with a smartphone but a plan? And that's the key thing for the individuals who live in poverty and in public mental health systems. They can't afford the smartphone, or they could probably afford the phone or get a recycled phone or somebody's hand-me-down phone. They need a plan, and those data plans and having consistent access to that information is not as easy for them. And so saying, hey, there's an app for that, or a lose weight app, or a running app, or a couch to 5K app, or whatever thing you're doing is really not necessarily an accessible technology for people who live in poverty, or they live in Wi-Fi deserts, or they live in remote areas, or, as our colleague said, they might need some coaching on what they're going to do besides you just handing them an app and saying that they can immediately launch a health promotion. So the things that we're really trying to address at our center in order to push the needle forward are these 4 factors, which are obviously person factors. All of us are accountable for our health. The question is how much we ever learn. How many of you came with an owner's manual for your body? My parents took a few pages out of mine. I'm just going to say that. If I were to ask each of you to tell me the next 3 medical tests you need to have based on your age and gender, how many of you feel that you could do that? All the old people like me, yeah, I could do it. Older people, experienced people. Most of us don't know. What rate should we be having pap smears as women? Should we be having them? Should we be having breast exams? What is our risk for breast cancer? Do you know your family histories of, the big illnesses? I don't know. So most of us don't even get close to our own owner's manual. So we approach illness from a catch-up place. We approach illness from our doctor tells us we have a thing, and now we have to treat that thing. Do we learn about the thing? What do we know about our illnesses? We've diagnosed thousands of individuals in recovery with major mental disorders. We have very little to tell them about why they have the mental disorder, the mystery of schizophrenia. It could be genetic. It could be your brain. It could be dopamine. It could be trauma. It could be inflammation. It could be all of those things. But you live with this illness now. We have to teach you how to manage that illness. Clinical factors that are associated with things such as the fact that our best frontline treatments, if you elect to use pharmacology and psychiatry, are probably going to cause some kind of metabolic syndrome that you're going to have to treat later. Preventing those illnesses or managing those illnesses is always going to be cheaper than the consequences of those illnesses. Unmanaged diabetes, most people are like, oh, that can lead to people having amputations, like a toe or a foot. Well, I'll tell you, by the time you need your foot amputated in diabetes health, you have a circulation disorder that has progressed so far that you don't just have issues with your extremities, you have heart disease. You probably also have damage to your retina when you progress with diabetes. Most people don't know those complications. They just know that people often will lose a limb if they don't treat their diabetes. Much more expensive than helping people learn and manage their regimens. Provider factors. All of us have talked about the stigma in provider factors. One of the most challenging things I encounter at the University of Illinois is every year we get a brand new crop of 200 young, enthusiastic, ridiculously smart medical students. And I ask them, how many of you would like to go into psychiatry? And 3 of them are like, 2 are sure, one of them does it out of shame and they hate, What the medical students tell me is, Dr. Rossano, I want to be a doctor because I want to help sick people get better. So one, they don't see mental illness as being something where people get better, and so the concept of recovery is something that we have to continue to push. But I want to invite them to come over to the Department of Psychiatry, because symptoms of schizophrenia and psychosis, depression aside, I have got plenty of medically sick people, most of whom are progressing faster than matched controls, most of whom are dying 25 years before their time has come. Come on over to the Department of Psychiatry. I got plenty of physical health illness for you to learn as young medical students. And then finally, symptom factors of poor integration, funding policies and system fragmentation. When we talk about Medicare and Medicaid coverage in this country, don't just characterize it as elderly people. Think about what happens to individuals who are in public entitled systems, who don't have the opportunity to work full time at a job that's going to offer them benefits. The majority of people with serious mental illnesses in this country are not only going to lose vital public entitlements, they're also probably going to be people who come in the column of pre-existing conditions as we move forward. So this is an enormous amount of people. It's close to 10% of the American population. So that's probably 35 million people with serious mental illness who are in public, not all of them are in public systems, would be affected by this. So you can contact us at the Center for Mental Health, Integrated Health and Self-Directed Care. You can also follow us on Twitter. We tweet pretty regularly about mental health policy and about health developments. And you certainly can contact me or any of my colleagues. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rosano. At this time, we'd like to move to the Q&A portion of the evening. And I'm going to ask the panelists to please join me up front of the room. I will start by asking a few questions and then open up the questions to the audience. My first question, given the fact that families share a significant number of genes, why are kids from the same families at times so drastically different? Is it because they are treated differently, or is it because of the relatively small amount of differences in DNA?
Well, I think this goes back to our nature versus nurture discussion that we were having earlier. Even if you're in the same family, clearly your genome is different unless you're identical twins. What's also important to note is that the environment in which you're growing up is different, depending on if you're one of 20 kids or one of 2 kids, or if there's 1 year between you and your sibling, or if there's 10 years in between you and your sibling. So all of these things, even though you're in the same family and we think it would be very similar, there can be many, many differences that are going to impact on your mental health status, both genetically as well as environmentally.
Thank you, Dr. Napier. How can incorporating mental health treatment in primary care physician offices improve mental health outcomes for the general population as well as the chronically ill?
Okay, it's a 2-part question. So one is, how can we improve mental health care in primary care? One thing is, I think it needs to be a multifaceted approach. We can encourage people to be more invested in mental health and certainly address their mental illnesses. But the stigma around mental illness, I would argue, and I think many of you would agree, is an enormous barrier to that. So when you go to your physician and he or she is saying to you, you know, I know you hurt your knee when you were running or biking or yoga or whatever thing you do, and I know you've been going to PT and I've been giving you something for it, but you know, just isn't progressing the way I think it should. I'd really like you to go next door and see my colleague in orthopedics and have that person take a look at your knee. What do you say to your doctor when he or she says that to you? You're like, I love you, man. You're looking out for me. But when you come in and after 6 or 8 months of you being down, or you having somatic pain, or you not sleeping, or you feeling edgy at work, and your primary care physician says, you know, I really want you to go next door and talk to my colleague who is a psychiatrist. What is your response to your physician? You're like, hey man, I am not crazy. I don't need a psychiatrist. And so people are resistant to treat mental illnesses with the same specialty and attention that we treat the rest of our bodies, because there's stigma about going to a psychiatrist or seeing a psychiatrist. The other thing that I think we need is more cross-disciplinary training. I can tell you that in medical school, our medical students at the University of Illinois actually get 6 weeks of a psychiatry clerkship, which is much longer. The average is about 2 to 3 weeks of psychiatry clerkship for individuals. So any psychiatrist that you see out in the world has actually had more medical school than mental health training until they get to their residencies. And then they actually get really intense medical or mental health training as psychiatry residents. Then the second part of that question...
how to bring it to the general population?
I think one way to bring it to the general population is for us to be much more open and honest about our mental health. And the areas where I do feel on some level we've made advances in any case would be both in depression and anxiety. I think that Americans are more willing to talk about depression and to talk about anxiety as mental health issues. Worldwide, again, depression is the #1 disabling condition. In the United States, we actually are diagnosing more people with anxiety than we are with depression, which doesn't really surprise me. We have a lot of anxiety in the country. But when you talk to people about other pervasive illnesses, psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia, people will change. One of the things that I really thought was interesting on your slide was that schizophrenia had the largest amount of stigma toward people who didn't want to marry or work with someone, but depression seemed much more approachable. Because think about it. All of us have been depressed at some point in our lives about something. All of us have been anxious. So we can empathize a little bit with those individuals. When it comes to being psychotic or having delusions or hallucinations, many of us can't relate to that. And so we don't have that empathy of, I felt that way before. And so I think we have a lot of work to do to try to reduce some of those issues and to really approach people in a humane way.
Thank you. And final question for me. Are there any specific warning signs that parents can look out for in order to protect their children from being cyberbullied or, more importantly, becoming a cyberbully?
Well, I think that, technology is rapidly changing. And I think before we arm our kids with devices, really as a parent, really understanding what these devices are and what they're capable of. And I always recommend that parents really start with very strong monitoring. And once they see their teen or their child using the technology in an appropriate way, sort of gradually giving them more and more freedom to use the actual technology. I think that also, initially, being on your teens' accounts, and in a transparent way, like, talking with them about how, initially I'm going to be monitoring your use and just see how they are utilizing the technology, and then having conversations, really, again, as I mentioned, tapping into that higher order thinking that adolescents are developing, and really having debates and problem solve with them around the sorts of experiences they're having online with peers.
Thank you. At this time, we would like to open up to questions from the audience. Please respect those with hearing disabilities and wait for the microphone when you want to ask a question. Also, since this program is being recorded, your voice will only be audible if you use the microphone.
Hi. We will be taking questions from the live audience when you raise your hands, but then we will also be taking some questions from our Conferences IO app for those that tuned in through online or would like to ask through the media instead.
Yes. Microphone.
With all due respect to the fact that there has been mention of pediatric mental illness or mental health concerns, so the conversation still ends up devolving into a focus on adults. Where is the attention in marketing and getting a message out, particularly when you talk about the escalation of the rates of suicides in both boys and girls? Where's the attention? Where's the marketing? Where's that message getting out that we need to really have a major focus on mental health in adolescents as much as we do adults?
I think that's a really, really important issue, and I we as a society are really coming to terms with what kind of research is necessary to better understand the developing, because it's a moving target. The things that we know about adults may not be applicable. In the Chicago area, for example, there's Robert Crown Center for Health Education that's located out in Hinsdale. Can you hear me? Is it turned on? Is this better? I was mentioning the fact that there's a center called the Robert Crown Center for Health Education, and it's actually located in Hinsdale. It's been around since 1970, involved in education of elementary and secondary school children. I'm one of the scientific advisors to the center to develop the whole curriculum on making healthy choices, how that might impact sexual behavior, on sexually transmitted diseases, on self-worth, on substance use disorders, and on suicidal tendencies. And I think that's one good example of us as a culture understanding that we've got to be able to look at the adolescent teenager as a completely different construct, if you will, than we would an adult when it comes to how the brain's working and in terms of emotional decision-making and, of course, hormones, as we all know. And so I do believe that we've come a long way. There's an enormous published on these particular facts as the individuals that are being studied.
And something I would also add to that is I think children's mental health is changing and evolving. So places you can look for research in this area would be not only the Hinsdale group, but also you can we have a pediatric mood disorders clinic that looks at depression and anxiety among young children. Also looks at childhood bipolar disorder. There's research going on there. And not only looks at behavioral aspects and educational aspects of intervention, they're also using functional imaging on developing children's brains and pharmacological interventions. And that's tricky. You know, the major treatment of mental illnesses, severe ones, is often including pharmacological agents. And I think you have to ask very important questions about whether you want to use those types of medications with children whose brains are not finished and with your child at all, about we know with brain science. One of the other areas is looking at school violence. And so there is a researcher at IJR named Jalil Abdul Adil, and he works with other researchers at IJR on a large Chicago-wide anti-violence project that looks at trauma and exposure to violence, anxiety, and depression, not only how it affects family and social life, but how it affects their school life in terms of preparing them to actually become adults and to be in the world. And so that would be research that I would strongly recommend. You could also look to in trying to address not only identifying these issues for young children, but trying to make advances in their most, I'd say, influential sphere, which is school. You know, adults go to work, kids go to school, and so sometimes that can be a really influential place to try and promote better mental health for kids.
And just very briefly to add to that, from a clinical perspective, there is a lack of mental health professionals that that specialize in pediatric mental health. So we see months and months wait lists for pediatric psychiatrists, for instance. And so from a workforce development perspective and a policy perspective, we really need to look at those issues. How do we build our capacity to serve kids with mental health needs?
Thank you. Okay, do we have another question? Okay. I can run the microphone. Let me run it. Here we go.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to say I'm really glad that the subject of trauma came up. I am a retired school social worker, and I remember yes. And one of the things that we, just in working in that system, trauma is it's universal. And when people don't take that into consideration, kids are going to they're going to look terrible. They're going to look psychotic. They're going to look whatever. And many times living in a community that where there's a whole lot of hostilities and what have you, it makes kids, it makes them, they have to put on the exterior coats And it takes, and this layering, it takes time. And so many times when they come in to see a therapist, you can't just automatically assume, well, this child is doing this, and therefore, according to the DSM-5 or whatever, they are this. And so I just wanted to say that we need to really look at clients from a trauma-based, informed, sort of like, scope. And don't just be, putting labels on them. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from the live audience? Or any comments you would like to make in response?
I mean, in my sphere, that is one area that I think I continue to see a lot of growth and development in, this sort of adoption of sort of this trauma-informed lens. I think that there's a lot of work occurring in that area, and I can see it kind of taking hold in the schools and in forensic environments, and so that's an exciting, I think, development in the field that needs to obviously continue to happen more and more.
Any other questions from the live audience? Yes. Do we have the second microphone? Nope, I'll just turn that up. A little exercise tonight.
Thank you. I think we all agree that stigma, as we talked about, is a huge barrier, but for professionals who enter the mental health or the medical health profession, that stigma doesn't just disappear. Have you had success, or do you have thoughts on how to kind of break that stigma down within our professions to help, educate, especially teachers or counselors, to be able to talk about those things and recognize those things within their own selves and in their own fields?
I usually would say here is this is one of the reasons that, at least in the research that we do and a lot of the partnerships and collaborations that we design, we have people with lived experience of mental illness, which is typically how they like to be referred, or people in recovery. One thing that I think is an enormous paradigm shift is the American Psychological Association, the American Nurses Association, the National Association of Social Workers. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to push through curricula called Recovery to Practice. And what the Recovery to Practice was designed to do was to address those major areas, psychiatry being the medical workforce, so the AMA's workforce in this case, to really talk with them about what recovery is and to couch mental illnesses the same way that we couch physical illnesses. No one in psychiatry says they're going to cure an illness. They're going to manage an illness. You don't cure diabetes, you manage it. You don't cure these things. And so to help people understand, I think, one, we don't have linear relationships, for why people have mental health problems. We know some risk factors like trauma or different kinds of family histories, whatever. But also just kind of to approach the illness from a much more positive, strengths-based type of paradigm, I think, is one thing. And then the other thing I would say is to be positive role models, whether you're a student or a social worker, a director or leader of a clinic. Research has been done that the two patient groups that medical student trainees, residents, and even attending physicians make jokes about the most in hospitals are obese patients and psychiatry patients. And so if you, in this case psychiatry, you hear that, you should stop a person and actually politely and professionally challenge that kind of thinking. And that, there's always the last group of people who are going to continue to make jokes or slight, and also try and reduce misconceptions that you see about people. About gun violence, about community violence, and try to help people better understand what the average life of an individual with a severe mental illness actually really looks like. And I think if we could do that and bring more visibility to people in recovery, I think that would be essential. I think there's young people. I don't like to rely on celebrities. But when you get someone like Demi Lovato to talk about her depression or another person to talk about her anxiety, it normalizes it for young people because they actually can identify with someone that is like them, who felt that way and actually is better and is going to be able to do better, and to kind of instill that hope. We instill hope in every single patient population except psychiatry. And I think that's a huge problem.
And just very briefly to add to that, I think that we need to take a prevention approach. So as a healthcare field, we're very reactive. You know, if someone's sick, we treat them. But let's focus more on prevention. Let's go to the schools. Let's talk broadly with the entire classroom about trauma, about mental health issues, before they become serious issues. You know, let's bring it out of the shadows and talk more about it. And again, you know, modeling for people, for clients, for students, for our colleagues. We're all impacted by mental health issues. You know, so telling our stories, I think, is a very powerful tool as well.
Thank you. And do we have an online question?
We do. The other microphone is misbehaving, so we're going to use this one for Q&A, and if we can pass around the lab for answering then. Okay, our first online question. Can you improve your inhibitory control, and how?
So I think the question was, can you improve your inhibitory control, and how? The answer is yes. It is difficult. And so a part of this, I think, has to do also with the age of the individual in which you would like to improve your inhibitory control. We know certainly, for example, the adolescent brain, where the frontal lobe may not be to the same developmental level as adults, that inhibitory control just isn't part of their biology. And honestly, thank goodness for that, because we want young people to go explore new worlds and seek out new civilizations, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you have a lot of inhibitory control, you won't do that. So understanding the developmental aspects of inhibitory control, I think, is very relevant in this question. In terms of an adult, for example, we know that behavioral and cognitive therapy is a very, very useful way of recognizing when inhibitory control needs to be implemented and how you might circumvent the temptation, if you will, of letting your orbitofrontal cortex run amok and putting checks and balances on it with inhibitory control. So both in psychology and psychiatry, there's a lot of good methodologies in which one can use. It does move to a pattern called habits, where you have to be able to almost subconsciously recognize some of these facets of your decision-making process, and that happens as you do it more and more. And practice makes perfect. Practice makes perfect, and that's when you can start relying more on your habits to help you make these choices.
What can Chicago learn from other major cities to improve our mental health care system?
Well, I can tell you that the Department of Public Health here in Chicago is progressively moving to be very much more aware of mental health issues. And I'm actually working with the mayor's office in this regard, and it is impressive, the people that are there and the passion that they have to sort of set aside programs in this regard. For example, we are getting very progressive in terms of this opioid abuse epidemics, and we have many programs that are in place, and we're reaching out to all facets of our community, both policymakers, those who are incarcerated, drug court judges, the police, community health professionals, the schools, and I think that we are coming together and organizing ourselves, unfortunately, around this epidemic, but it's allowing us to recognize what we can do in terms of not only opioid use disorders, but also mental health disorders in general.
And we actually do have some, in Chicago's credit, I don't think we're a perfect city, but we have some strangely forward-thinking things here. One of them is Cook County Jail that happens to be here. And what's forward-thinking about Cook County Jail, as probably one of the largest publicly funded mental health providers in the country, is that the leader of the jail, not just the health clinic, the leader of the jail is a clinical psychologist. And that is very forward-thinking, I believe, on behalf of the sheriff, to recognize that mental illness, trauma, violence, and substance use are why people are often in the jail. And if we don't address those things and we don't look at them from a larger systemic context, I think that would probably be a liability. I will say, I think it's not just Chicago. And while we get most of the attention as the largest municipality in our state has to take a long, hard look at what it thinks about in terms of mental health funding. And I think every state has to do that. But some states have some very forward-thinking programs. In California, they have what's called Proposition 63. And what that brought the state of California was that a millionaire's tax, and that for everybody who earned over $1 million who was paying taxes, 1% of that tax base was given to the state mental health system in California, which changed things overnight once the fiscal year of the state rolled over. And not only did they take those dollars to devote them to evidence-based practices in mental health throughout California, they also made it so the state couldn't borrow against them or use them for other purposes, so that they actually would be dedicated to the health and the care of people with serious mental illnesses. And that not only includes, traditional kinds of mental health, forensic mental health, but probably also in this particular case, mental health of people who are displaced populations or immigrant populations, because of course the demographic of California probably looks a little different. But state funding policies at the local level can be enormously influential on mental health systems, and I personally believe that's an area where the entire state of Illinois could probably do a little better than what we've been able to do so far.
Just want to say briefly about the children's mental health system here in Chicago. I personally find it incredibly siloed, and particularly as we see kids, older adolescents, transitioning into the adult mental health system, I find that there's a huge disconnect there, and kids often sort of fall out of the system at that phase in their lives. And there's also huge disparities in terms of access to mental health care in our city. We've seen major community mental health centers lose funding in sort of the south sides and west sides of Chicago. We see families traveling all the way to Lincoln Park to access services, and so there's just huge disparities in terms of access.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you for your questions, and thank you more for the important discussion. C2ST would like to thank the Society for Neuroscience Chicago chapter, the ARCS Foundation Illinois chapter, and the National Alliance on Mental Illness Chicago for partnering with us on this program. Remember to fill out the survey on c2st.cnf.io to be entered for a chance to win a free Morton Arboretum Day Pass. Your responses are important analysis metrics that allow us to know how we are doing and what we can improve in the future. Thank you so much for coming out, and let's give a big thank you to our speakers.